Thank you very much, Alan. Good morning, everyone. I certainly am daunted. I don't know how I managed to keep going through the 3 hours today, but I'll try, and straight away I'll remove the query over the black box. And that is the fact that we know less about the Faroe Islands from probably any point of view than we know about any of the other areas I'm talking about in the North Atlantic. And so this is a modelling term that we perhaps look at events and processes, and we're not sure what's going on within at all. And I think that certainly applies to the Faroe Islands from a medieval point of view. Sverre Dahl was someone that we mentioned yesterday. And the State Antiquarian produced in 1970 in Medieval Archaeology a paper on the Norse settlement of the Faroe Islands, which was, I guess, a state-of-the-art pronouncement on what was known. And up to 1970, this was the de facto picture of settlement. And I think you'll agree with me, there's very little upon that map. Even if we add the Sheeling names, which are not there, you wouldn't exactly say that we're looking at a highly populated land surface. And in 1995, when Hayward published a map, it was based totally upon the map that Sverre Dahl had produced within that medieval archaeology paper. And to our view, this is totally unbelievable, unlikely, and untrue. So we set out to do something about that. Let's look at another view of it, and that is a view of Alan Small, the late Alan Small from Aberdeen and then Dundee universities, who in a Viking, in a saga book paper and also in a Viking Congress paper, had looked at the presence of people in the Faroe Islands, and he recognized the limitations on the available, from the available historical data. And his view was that one way around this, in a sense not going awfully far, but at least drawing people's attention to the fact that the modern infields within the archipelago represent the probable distribution of the Norse settlement areas. And if you look at any settlement within the Faroes, he suggested that this model of a settlement unit would apply. We need access to the sea for the boats. You have an infield area, land suitable for farming, some arable, if at all, and then this wider area of grazing land beyond it. And let's add a stream for good effect. This all suggests itself, of course. In a sense, it doesn't get you very far. It's common sense. The historian, Arne Torstensen, he looked at the land register for 1584 and the Budir or the Bygdir. He said that if you look at the 85 units, that in his view, these were almost certainly unchanged since the medieval period. And that these can be used to reconstruct settlement patterns. The sources that one can look at if you wish to move further on from the Sverre Dahl map and the idea of small concerning infield areas is to try and go back through all the available documents, of course, from the Faroe Islands, which might indicate some idea of settlements and their location. The dog letter from about from 1350, and this was an amendment to something we'll mention again, the Sederbrevet, the sheep letter of 1298. There are stipulations on taxes from the late 1300s into the early 1400s, the land register, which was mentioned a moment ago. Archaeological sites themselves, which had barely been collected in a sense, had barely been mapped, even though people knew about them. And there's always the Faroese saga, the saga of the Faroe Islanders, that one finds in the Flatjar book, along with the Orkneyinga saga and the Greenlinger saga. And so if you look at any settlement within modern settlement area, within the Faroes, and this is Leavik on the island of Eysturoy in the northeast of the archipelago, one can find a whole series of mentions of early settlement there. So that, for example, we have a Toftanes, which is Toftanes. We'll hear more about that very soon. A good-going Norse longhouse settlement. There is also this one here within the village, and well, you can't see very much there. It's actually, at least you're not seeing it under a pile of tyres, which is the norm. And the Bonhus site, the prayer house site within Leavik. Also, we'll see more about that in a moment. And if you consider Dahl's map, what we did was to, in working along with Soimund Agi and other people from the Faroe Islands, the historians, Arne Torstensen especially, we mapped every available site that is mentioned in the old documents and the archaeological ones, which were they're all on slips of paper in people's desks, but they hadn't actually been mapped. And obviously you can see perhaps lots of red dots there, but it's a bit difficult to really take that in. So let's just look at one area in Suðuroy there, and you can see that there is some density there, very much a coastal emphasis, and this could be repeated for just about every island. The thing to remember, of course, is that we're not saying that these were all occupied at the same time, so don't assume that, but at least we're getting much closer to where people would have been, and given that many of these are archaeological sites of an early Norse type, then, and in many cases settlements that were still in use in the modern period, then I think we're getting a lot closer to what was happening in the Faroe Islands. And if you want to read about that in a lot more detail, you can see it in that paper in Human Ecology for 2005. On the right there, we can see Alan Small's map, again, with the imposition of the sites that I showed you a moment ago. And of course, he got much of that absolutely right. It's awfully constrained, of course, because given the topographic nature of the Faroe Islands, as we saw in the last lecture with this very coastal concentration of places that you really could settle, then there's not going to be much choice anyway, and that's emphasized in the this aerial shot which I showed you yesterday. Well, there's lots of other things that one could look at here, and I'm not going to look at all of these at all, but these are discussed, and different place names associated with different islands and different areas within the islands. But there is also churches as another component of settlement which have been barely considered, apart from the main churches, and that's the Magnus Cathedral in Juniper. But if we're looking at distribution, then we've got to go for this type of settlement, no, not settlement, but this type of ruin, which one can find all over the Faroe Islands. These are the bonhus, the prayer houses, these circular chapel-like buildings. If one compares them with elsewhere in Iceland and Greenland, And this is Stefan Stuman Hansen in the middle of one, in the island of Eysturoy, in the town in which he lives, in Leirvik. And there you can see the configuration of that structure, and it's one of something like 34 now that are known, and you can read about in Acta Archaeologica and also in Archaeologia Icelandica. And these 34 were not known. Some of them were known about at the time when Dahl was writing and presenting his map, but they're not on his map. And so this adds, they are on ours, or most of them are, on the maps we published in 2005. But it certainly indicates gives you a good idea of where people, of course, were living at a very early stage, assuming that these structures are early. In addition to that, and we'll come to that in a moment, but in addition, Stefan Stuman Hansen and John Sheehan suggest that the island of Skúvoy, with its incised crosses, gives one a good idea of places where early Christianity would have began, and also worked on by Ian Fisher, who says that these show a clear Irish influence which have no close Scandinavian parallels. Well, we touched upon the Papar yesterday, and this isn't the place to review that. But of course, we could be looking, if one accepts this, looking at connections with the Irish or the Scottish influence in the Faroe Islands here. And this has exercised people over a number of years if you delve into what they've been saying, though it's often not repeated very much, probably because not many people write about the Faroe Islands. They all head straight for Iceland and Greenland. That often includes the Danes, who have a romantic view of Greenland, for example, and many of them never go to the Faroe Islands. This is a Norwegian, of course, Christian Keller, who has looked at the circular churchyards of Iceland and Greenland. And he was, in 1989, in his thesis, talked about this as being probable influence of Celtic Christian style, and he makes a connection of with Irish monks or perhaps Norse Christians going to Iceland. And this is further developed by Stefan Stuman Hansen and John Sheehan, who are very much influenced by the writings of Keller, but also their own beliefs that, as it turned out, could well be true, about a very early presence of anchorites in the Faroe Islands, but suggesting that we're in reality looking at a North Atlantic distribution here, and not just an Icelandic and Greenland one, and that the Christianization of the North Atlantic region owes more to Ireland than to Norway. Not everyone would agree with this. But if you look at the 2011 paper, for example, he talks about the resemblances, other than the fact that many of the Faroese sites have a much broader wall, or the diameter, the radius of the wall around the churches is much greater than one typically finds in Iceland and in Greenland. But apart from that, morphologically speaking, these are very similar. But what he says, quite correctly, I guess for an archaeologist, is that archaeological excavations are really needed, or investigations are needed at these sites in the Faroes if we're going to get any further. Since he wrote that, a paper has appeared by Argi and Mikkelsen. It's in Faroese. It's a local magazine called Frodi, and this talks of a site at Valba. It's another. It is a bonhus site. It is a prayer house site, one of these chapel sites, and this is it's not a full excavation report or anything like that, but you can see here is the the Bonhu site, and with various steadings beside it. And in the eroding coast there, the tibia and fibula of an individual, and that's been dated to about AD 1000. We haven't got a full radiocarbon date reported in that publication. So that's around about the time when it's supposed that Christianization actually arrived in the Faroe Islands, as it did in Iceland and so on. So once again, you've got to look at the elasticity of radiocarbon dates, and that doesn't really get us much further, but at least it's a start that these sites are fairly early in the process, and we clearly need a lot more investigation of those sites to be able to say more about any such connections. This doesn't actually prove that this individual was related to the history of that site, other than being found in the cliff face. One assumes part of the burial ground there, but there is no more information within that publication, so it's rather difficult to say more, and one looks forward to the appearance of a full report. Well, we mentioned Magnus Cathedral there, which may or may not have been finished. It's a moot point, may never have been roofed. And just peeking at the back of that, we have the King's Farm, which is 11th century, and in fact the same family has certainly lived in that for about half a millennium. And beyond that, St. Olaf's Church, which is 12th century. There was an even older church, actually, which is partly removed by coastal erosion, very close to that, and the area is a World Heritage Site at the moment. But what about the resource base of the Faroe Islands? Well, the Faroe Islands today are pretty treeless. There is a tree. If you go into Tórshavn, the capital, you will see a park with planted trees, virtually all aliens, many of them from Patagonia. There is actually a forestry commission in the Faroe Islands. Many of the islands have a patch of woodland upon them, so you go through the archipelago and it's punctuated with these little areas of woodland, and you wonder what the point of this really is. It's perhaps to remind people of what a tree looks like, if they ever knew. Has this always been the case? Well, if you look at the pollen diagrams, pretty much so. Just look at the dark silhouette to the left of all of those diagrams from different places on the island, right in the middle, Sandoy. And you can see that the content, the pollen content of arboreal types, nearly all tree birch, is a couple of %. There is no way that we're talking about, I wouldn't even call it a lightly wooded archipelago. There were stands of woodland here and there, maybe, very low density in that island, and this could be repeated from the pollen diagrams available from just about every island. What about another aspect of this, and that is the spread of peat? Because if you go to outside of the town, well, towns, there's a handful of towns. If you go outside the settlements in the Faroe Islands, then what you find is peat. Peat is everywhere. And one of the things that interested us is, when did that really spread? And the reason we ask this is because if you look at the actual process of peat formation, which we're not really going to do now and can't possibly do, waterlogging figures very largely within the process. And also, there's a whole series of other angles, such as climate and soil change and what have you. And in a review of the process by Peter Moore back in 1993, what he did was to come to the conclusion that human activity is rather more important than people had hitherto supposed. And he uses examples from Wales, from Norway, to indicate that in many areas that people have been engaged in, especially in pastoral agricultural and marginal areas, then you've got a spread of peat. The same kind of process that many years ago Bruce Proudfoot wrote about in the Neolithic for Northern Ireland. And so what we thought we would do is actually try and investigate this a little bit for the Faroe Islands. And this is one site around the lake of Littlevatn, and we thought it provided us with a unique opportunity to study the spread of blanket peat, because apart from the indications of people that we saw yesterday on this same island, essentially, as far as one can tell, the islands would have been unpopulated or only very lightly populated, certainly nothing in terms of the arrival of the Scandinavians, the conventional landnam period of AD 800-ish. So we thought this was a great laboratory. And we could also look at how this varied over space and time if we looked at it in detail in one area here and also looked at it in relation to published work from elsewhere in the Faroe Islands. We looked at 9 sites around Littlevatn, and we were judging the arrival of peat by the organic content of the material in our cores and the pollen evidence for peat-forming species such as heather and crowberry and so on. And that would give us a date when we might be able to see or infer that peat spread, but blanket peat spread had begun. And if we look around that area, we can see that these circles are proportionate to age. That's the oldest site. Peat spread there from about 5,500 years ago. There's no way that that was Norse, we assume. And the youngest site, 1270 BP. Okay, let's look at that distribution along with the distribution of dates from the whole of the Faroe Islands. It's an even spread. This argues against any climatic cause. If there was a sudden climatic cause, we would start to see, or we imagine we would see, much more conformity in the period when peat was beginning to spread across the islands and within islands. If there had been strong Norse influence, then it would have been around about then. And, you know, I don't think 3 sites counts as an indication that the Norse were responsible for major peatland spread in the Faroe Islands. And this would favour a pedogenic, a soil-based explanation, a combination of waterlogging and so on at the right time in the right places. So I think we can get rid of any ideas that humans, and in particular the Norse, were involved in the spread of peat in anything other than a very marginal fashion. There's another angle which has been reiterated in the literature, and that's by, it stems back to work from Alan Small, a paper in Acta Boreali. And what I've done is to look at that in relation to the pollen evidence and the archaeological evidence. What Alan Small was saying was that the decline of juniper in the Faroe Islands was particularly due to goats, and that goats arrived with the Norse and they immediately did for the juniper. They were chewing away at all the juniper that was available, and you see it in all the, you see juniper in all the pollen diagrams. Let's look critically at that evidence, and that's what was attempted in that 2008 publication. That gives you an idea of goats having a go at woodland, which they can do. Don't imagine it was like that, please, in the Faroe Islands. This is more like we're talking about. Really, not totally, but probably dwarf juniper. Now, if you look at the archaeological evidence, juniper has clearly been very important during the Norse period and beyond. In that top slide there, you can see juniper ropes, 9th to 10th century. We'll come back to those. They're from Toftanes, obviously of value to the Scandinavians. And there you can see some surviving juniper wood in peat, and probably with a modal date in the 1500s. So it's obviously wood surviving right through the Norse period. If you look at the dates on the radiocarbon dates available for juniper, then you can see that that would be making allowances for the ranges on dates. That would be the Norse period. The dates are spread all the way through there. This doesn't tell us when juniper actually disappeared. It just tells us when juniper was either in use in the archaeological sites or in the environmental sites, was found in various deposits. It doesn't really get us very far if you're trying to get at the history of juniper. And if you look at the archaeological evidence, and obviously there's this huge problem in trying to separate the sheep and the goats skeletally, which people are far more confident about now than they used to be. But we're only talking about a couple of sites which have reported goat remains. The rest, they're either indicated as sheep or sheep-goat. And if we look at the pollen, I think this is the way you've got to go there in order to look at this, because this is giving you, it's not restricted in time terms other than the age of the deposits themselves. So we're not looking at the restricted time period indicated by the life of an archaeological site, but we can look at what's going on over a landscape over time. And if we look at one site there, Grotesvatn, then that's the decline of juniper. There's Landnam, there's the settlement period. It was down long before the Norse arrived. If you look at another site, Tjørnavik, which we looked at yesterday, it's round about the same time. And so that's the kind of site that would have suited the model being presented by Alan Small. But if we then look beyond that to sites around the area we've just been looking at, around Littlevatn, then what we're seeing there is that the dates are coming in long after the arrival of the Norse. In fact, there is no evidence here that it was down to either goats or the Norse at all. And in fact, juniper will survive in many areas, certainly where sheep and what would have been goats, presumably, could not actually access, such as in gullies and what have you. But there is no solid evidence that the Norse did for the juniper, any more than that the Norse were responsible for the spread of peat in the islands. So there's no evidence, and I imagine that goats were not a major feature of the Faroe Islands, because there's probably too little scrub for them anyway. And if you're going to, goats were very prominent in Greenland, but they served a purpose there, and they could survive in many cases on rougher ground than would have been the case than would have been available in the Faroe Islands. But I think that the people would have favoured sheep rather than goats, and I think that's what comes out of the excavation evidence. But there's very little excavation evidence, as we will see anyway. So no link. So what about the rest of the resources available? Well, I'm not going to labour this one, but there's certainly lots of bird life. There's fish, there's whales, There's all kinds of resources available to people to develop, and indeed they did. And we had developments of infield and outfield. We had changes to soil management, as we will see. And puffins, of course, are often associated with the Faroe Islands, but not just. The fish, pilot whale particularly. You don't need me to tell you about that, I'm sure. But within the farm area, then we have the resources available at the seashore itself with driftwood and seaweed, and we have these fouling cliffs. And this could be repeated for just about every settlement within the Faroe Islands, and also areas which became shieling areas beyond the infields. Let's take a look at some of this for a couple of settlements, and Leirvik will be the first one, followed by Sandoy. This is a rather wonderful picture of looking out towards Leirvik. And if you go to Leirvik and look at it from the sky, you can maybe just about make out the shape of the area, the harbour area there. You certainly can there, but in particular right there, I think you'll see a rather nice longhouse, and that's what it looks like on the ground. This is the site of Toftanes, excavated by Stefan Stuman Hansen, and coming towards publication now. And there is the site under excavation, and that will give you a good idea of what was found. What's not known is what's been removed by the stream to the right-hand side of that of the picture, and the sea on just beyond the outhouse. The site produced what one finds in many of the settlements of the North Atlantic, and archetypally Norse, with steatites, with soapstone, net sinkers made of local basalt, and schist whetstones, probably coming from Norway. But not just that, a cross. And there were several crosses at Toftanes. It's probably devotional crosses, made of larch. So this is driftwood. Also, the ropes that I told you about, that Stina Larsson and Stefan Stuman Hansen recovered from the site, and something like 100 meters of this material, and some of them still attached to large boulders and used for either nets or to hold down the roofs of houses, more probably at this site. And in addition, much macrofossil material, especially spruce and larch. In fact, over 80% was driftwood, and it was used especially for the posts within the houses. And you can get an idea of this material even at the present day. Here's driftwood on the island of Nolsoy. We're talking about extremely large pieces of wood, as you can see here. If you look at the dates from Toftanes, and without repeating the caveats about the calibration curve, we can see that these all come within the early Norse period, which would be consistent with the artifacts found at the site also. So it's a very nice suite of sites, of dates from Toftanes. And the pollen diagram, which is very difficult to interpret because, like many sites from archaeological contexts, it's very bitty. I think we can say there that we had grazing with cereals in a largely unwooded landscape, so no surprise there. Then there was a phase of reduced intensity with simply pastoralism, intensification and some local burning, which may be just domestic. I'm not saying it's related to preparing of the land for to increase nutrient content and improve soils for arable, but there was a return to mixed pastoral arable mix at the site. And once again, I stress that this is a partial picture, because what we really want are continuous sedimentary profiles rather than just bits and pieces gathered by the archaeologists. It's not their fault. They can only produce what is actually there, but it gives you a very staccato image of change through time, and it's not ideal. Unfortunately, the area or the areas that we would like to have obtained peat from, they've all been scalped, they've all gone. The material has disappeared because people have used this as a fuel over the last millennium. If you look at other evidence from the site, there has been an increase in species diversity of both plants and insects, and that the insect faunas lacked ectoparasites and a foul beetle component. It raises the question, the possibility, that at this site, and given the climate of the Faroe Islands, that perhaps stock was not stored over winter in the farm buildings, which is what we would typically find in Iceland or in Greenland. And the increase in the diversity is very often due to the increase in, but it's not always found, but often an increase in the number of habitats available to plants when people move into an area, and also the plants that they're bringing with them from whichever homelands they come from, whether that be Britain, Ireland, Norway or Denmark. Otherwise, the sites compare very well and are consistent with what one finds in the Scandinavian areas of the North Atlantic. And there is a picture of some of the stored hay fauna from Toftanes to keep ever happy. One of our entomologists on the project. Soils are clearly going to be very important. Here was the Stirling team, Ian Simpson, looking at soils and their status. We were followed around by a French TV documentary team for about a week and a half. If you look at the soils in the Faroe Islands, then they are typically very, not typically, if you look away from the sites, then you have all the normal horizons and no indication of much in the way of any modification at all. If you look in the infield areas of the sites that we've been looking at, such as Toftanes and elsewhere, then we find that the sites are often very homogenized. There's a lot of mixing been going on. There is the bringing in of manure and any refuse that can add to the fertility of those soils. And this, of course, is this augmentation, this enhancement is a sign to us that there has been soil management going on. And one can look at this through time by modelling, looking at the evidence from the soil, the micromorphology, from the chemistry, from the structure of the soils, and feeding it into models as Ian Simpson and Paul Adderley and others have done for the project, to try and look through time and to say, was it necessary in order to have a sustainable agriculture in the Faroe Islands and in the other island groups in the North Atlantic? And if you're going to do that kind of exercise, you need to validate it really against historical evidence. And this has been done at this site. There's Rolf Guttersson's work on the diaries of the Matras family from the island of Bordeaux. And it's looking at barley yields through time, and compare that with the reconstruction that the Stirling group have managed, and it's very, very similar. And so this gives one some confidence to go ahead and to try and do this further back in time. And this has been done. This is quite unreadable and has various things superimposed upon it. This is for the home field at Leavik, which contains the Norse site of Toftanes. So I've simplified this for you here, looking at barley and hay through time, 800 AD on the left-hand side of the x-axis through to about 1500 on the right. And you can see what happens there if you use different quantities of manure, if you graze, if you don't graze the infield, and if you do graze the infield, then you're going to have a lower yield per annum, and this shows itself through time as well. And so it shows you the importance of, if you want to increase yields, to enhance these soils and to manage these landscapes. And it was crucial, manuring was crucial as far as the modelling shows, to maintain hay and cereal cropping. Climate is sufficiently benign to allow home field grazing, so home field infield grazing throughout the year. But if you do that, if you do graze your infield with this, as I indicated, with aftermath grazing, it does reduce the yield. And so this would have been, it would have depended on the size of your infield, whether you would have allowed that or kept the animals out of the infield and simply used it to take off the hay when you needed it for storage for the winter. Let's move from Leirvik down to Sandoy. And Sandoy is the modern village. And there is the site we talked about yesterday, Ungejunkerin's Floti, that Mike Church has also looked at, as well as the important site of Assonden. And if you look at Sander here, you've got the church site there. Interestingly, supposed pagan graves outside the current churchyard. It was the site of a silver corn hoard, and lots of bones in the cliff, the eroding cliff, and that's been looked at, excavated back, and various surveys done by Mike and Soymoon Argyll. Sander Church itself's interesting because, in fact, it's not just one church. Well, it is one church, but it's been many churches over time, as you can see from Knud Krog's excavations here. If you look at his publications, he also brings in a Bonhus type structure there. Absolutely no evidence whatsoever. He does that, but there is no archaeological evidence. Perhaps he felt there should have been one. Mike excavating, and this is a section in the cliff there, essentially midden material. And you can see three main phases in the face there, going back to the 9th century up to the 13th century. And the dates for the site, all very nicely and perhaps not surprisingly, all very conformable, all very good, and show quite not too much differentiation between them. So there was a fairly rapid build-up of the material at this site. Once again, caveats over the calibration curves. And if you look at the material there, and this is really the best evidence we've got for the economy of the Faroe Islands at the moment. And the big problem is when you're dealing with an area where you may have, let's say, one or two archaeologists, one or two botanists, and what have you. It's very difficult for there to be a lot of sustained work in these small island groups unless you've got people coming in and working with people on the islands and trying to really increase the evidence available. And here at the site, we can see that domesticated animals only represent up to 8%. This doesn't mean to say that they were only relying to that extent on domesticated animals for their diets, because it's a question of survival and where one's actually excavating. But it's not a great deal. And through time, cattle are going down, not unusual in a North Atlantic situation. Pigs are fairly constant, but the big winners through time are sheep, goat, and we're assuming in the main that we're talking about sheep there. Perhaps no big surprise, because obviously the Faroe Islands mean sheep islands. But if you look at the non-domesticated component of that diet, then you can see here that fish are a very large part, if one's assuming that proportionality of surviving material indicates importance within the diet. Puffin, which the moratorium on eating puffin at the moment in the Faroe Islands. But also limpets. I'm not suggesting that people were actually eating these things, but that certainly for the baiting are involved in fishing and so on. And if you look at it in a North Atlantic context, as one sees here, and exclude what's happening in Greenland, which is quite different to what's happening in the Faroes, then what we have here are less domestic animals, more birds and mollusca than most parts of the North Atlantic. But one has to emphasize this is one site only. But let's take another angle on diet, and that's the isotope evidence. And if you look at bone material, both faunal and human, for this period, then what you can see here is from the delta 13C, which is an indication of diet and how terrestrial as opposed to how marine it happens to be, that essentially across the Faroe Islands, or across the sites indicated by the red dots in the map, then the animal diet was terrestrial. They were not, for example, feeding seaweed or fish to the sheep. And as far as the humans are concerned, suggested 20 to 40% marine diet. Not a big surprise. This is more marine than the Icelanders in general, but less marine than the Greenlanders, and this is something we will return to this afternoon. Let's just take one other angle on the fauna here and look at the names to indicate pigs. Well, one could start with Svinøy. There's an island which is Pig Island, and lots of other names all across the Faroe Islands indicative of pigs. And there at the southern tip of Sandoy, close to where we've just been talking about at Sander, you have, for example, the Grisgårda, the pig dikes. And one can assume that this is presumably related in some way to the corralling of pigs. And there they are, stretching up the hill slope. And over here on Voa, near the airport for the Faroe Islands, one also has these Svinatoftir, swine ruins in the outfield of Soravoa. Not excavated, just like so much of the Faroes. Very few sites in reality in the Faroe Islands have been excavated. So I think it re-emphasizes his whole black box idea that there is so little that we know about the Faroe Islands. Move down to Hov, and here we have this wonderful natural amphitheatre, and Andy Dugmore and the geomorphological group from Edinburgh were looking at landforms and landform change in many areas, and this is one of them. And they produce maps that show you what's going on in and around the home fields and some of the outfield areas. And what's of interest there, for instance, is the possibility of drainage at a very early stage going on in the outfield. This has drainage for the purposes of removing water, and quite different from the irrigation that, believe it or not, one sees, for example, in Greenland, and that we will come to tomorrow. One looks at the map here. We've talked about sheilings in here, or we mentioned the fact that shieldings existed. And if we look at the map of shielding sites, both place name and ruin sites themselves, one can see that these have received a very small amount of attention. In fact, I think 3 sites have been looked at. This is one by Stefan Sturman Hansen on the island of Fuloy, and there is a shielding site in there, and there is its Ergi name that one would also find, of course, in Gaelic areas in Scotland. This one meaning the hollow by the shielding. Argisbrekka, another Ergi name that we saw yesterday, with its houses. And one can look at the dating of sites such as that. And these are coming in fairly early, 10th, 11th century in all probability. Probably soon after we have the development of longhouses within the Norse settlements. If we look at Hovsdala here more widely and go up to the shielding area, we have another Ergidola here, looked at by Sverri Dahl. And this is a site that we did pollen work on, and this will show you one of the problems we have trying to date here. When we can try and get round the limitations of radiocarbon dates by using tephra chronology. It's rather failed, I get you would have to say, in the Faroe Islands. It works very well in Scotland, it works well in Iceland, but in the Faroe Islands, where you have such steep slopes and disturbance of materials, then it hasn't really worked. There is a tephra horizon in a deposit from beside the shielding site, and because of remobilization of soils on slopes, we're getting the same horizon being repeated as the deposits accumulated over time. You can't really, obviously you can use the first instance of that tephra as a sign of what's going on, but then it suggests to you that you've got to be very wary of the material beyond that. So one goes to a safer site, or as safe a site as one can get, rely on radiocarbon, and at this site, the thing that perhaps will not be totally apparent to you is that everything here is very muted. And in fact, when we first published this site, we were very muted in our interpretations about what was going on. We were perhaps overly cautious. In here we have reduction in woodland types, in tree birch, and the richness, this is a statistical measure in the pollen, perhaps goes up a bit, indicating that there are people around and they're starting to disturb the area. And we're getting some soil erosion going on at a very early stage here, because the organic content of the material is going down. So that means there's minerogenic material from above being washed down into the site. And then a bit later, we have an increase in sedges and in heather. There seems to be something much more extensive going on here. And richness towards the end of that is starting to go down. Are we getting some kind of decrease in richness in the flora because we're suddenly getting a monoculture, if you like, of plant types across that area? And then finally birch going down at the top, even more sedges and richness going down, and more erosion. And we think that that is indicating in there the shielding period. Whereas there, we're looking at rangeland, we're looking at the development of not just a small shielding area, but the development of an extensive outfield area, what in the North Atlantic is often called rangelands. And then we're moving towards the end of this period into the Little Ice Age, when when everything is just starting to go downhill. People don't disappear; they're carrying on here, as in Iceland, all the way through the Little Ice Age. But perhaps activity is showing itself as becoming more difficult. Our shielding area then is replaced by the development of the outfield, the hagi, and we have this spread over that landscape of the Faroe Islands, and this is typical here of an outfield of a rangeland. And this seems to be indicated as well in the literature. The sheep letter, the Sailor Brevet that I mentioned we used before, of 1298, and this mentions this extensive landscape sheep farming. It implies perhaps, no, it's an argument from absence, that shealing activity was finished by the time that this was produced in 1298. And that was Håkon Magnussen's decree. This was drawn up by the bishops of the Faroes and from Shetland, covering every aspect of sheep farming, such as common grazing and how it was to be practiced. So once again, suggesting that we'd moved by this stage into a much more extensive system of resource use. And we can attempt to model some of this, again, using a different model, which is what Amanda Thompson and Ian Simpson have done at Stirling, using a different model, Boom model, which looks at the utilisable biomass in such areas at Landnam and beyond. And what that shows is that the introduction of rangeland grazing led to widespread vegetation change and contributed to land degradation. But that it didn't deteriorate, the landscape did not deteriorate to a level that would cause major changes. In other words, people could still continue, they could still farm this land. You have degeneration, but you can keep going, despite the soil conditions and despite the climate conditions. This would not have been the same everywhere. However, if you look at over many parts of the Faroes, then you can see erosion in many places. It's demonstrably a very sensitive landscape. And this simply summarizes what's going on any given slope. That could be anywhere in the Faroe Islands. And one sees it here as well. And up around Saxonadala, this great area of gullying, farming going on, I mean grazing going on all around it. But this is just part and parcel of life, of living in these areas. And it would appear to have been the case for the last millennium. And if you look at this over time, to finish up with, then we will see erosion going on from long before the Scandinavians arrived and right through towards into the Norse period. And if you look at going back to our lake of Littlevatn, then what we see there is that soil erosion beginning in the mid-Holocene at that site, round about 2,500 BC, and then when Landnam comes along, we get an acceleration. But it's part of an ongoing process. And up at Saxonadala, which gives its name to a very famous tephra horizon, the Saxonadala ash, then in the core that came from that site, which is a 35-metre long core, analysed initially by Johannes Johansson, that we discussed yesterday in relation to early cereals, then at that site, we're starting to get erosion as indicated by reverse radiocarbon dates and the steepening of the radiocarbon curve from 220 AD. But then at Landnam, but just before Landnam, we start to get a big change in there. And that would have gone on right to the present day. We can't say that that's down to human activity. Landnam is coming in up there. And the site of Haugsvatn here, that's our boat. But it's not our work. We were beaten to it. We didn't realise. We'd taken the cause, started work, and then another publication appears. A Swedish-Danish group. However, interesting, their work shows a great hastening of acceleration through time, as inferred from the radiocarbon age depth curve, an inflection in here, with reverse dates and maximum catchment erosion actually AD 300 to 800. Landnam is coming in up here. So if you look at a resource model, I mean, if one can call it that, of the Faroe Islands, then what we have is a big amalgam of things going on here that have to be taken into account. It's not, I've presented you a very selective group of images, if you like, a series of vignettes of the story of the pharaohs during the Norse period proper. And one has all these things going on at the same time, with grazing pressures upon a landscape that's already rather geomorphically unstable. And you're also taking resources from nature, drawing down natural resources, as well as producing your own resources through farming. And this has all kinds of consequences of population and population change as well. Very last slide, I think, is the whole question of genetics. And if you look at the work that's been done, not on ancient DNA, it has to be emphasized, but on modern human populations, then what one sees is, for the Faroe Islands, and indeed this is replicated for Iceland, is the fact that 2/3 of the men, or of the male inherited DNA, it would seem to suggest 2/3 of the people were of Scandinavian stock. Now, whether that's coming directly from Scandinavia or coming from Scandinavia via Ireland and the west of Scotland and the Northern Isles is another matter, but people of Scandinavian genetic stock moving to the Faroes and to Iceland, whereas 2/3 of the females, it would suggest, are of British or Irish origin. So you can make your own, draw your own conclusions about what was happening there, but it fits in with lots of other evidence, as we will see when we get to Iceland. Thank you very much.